Hi, everyone. Welcome to Climate Money. This podcast is dedicated to exploring the most interesting stories and interconnections in the climate economic transition that's transforming markets around the world. I'm Susan Su, an early-stage climate technology investor and advisor to climate nonprofits and initiatives, and this is my attempt at sharing lesser-seen developments that have big implications. I hope it helps everyone out there in the climate world better understand where things are headed. So with that, let's jump into episode 9. First, I hope you enjoyed last week's episode on how the EU is taking on fast fashion with new extended producer responsibility laws that, in a pretty bold move, are actually tackling the gnarly problem of textiles. This was a fun episode and big research project for me where I published a longer form essay with all the stats and data at Climate Money Substack. So if you'd prefer or are just curious about a medium to longer form read over a listen, you can check it out there, complete with plenty of graphs and pictures. Now this week, we're doing another deep dive into another climate iceberg. And by that, I mean an area where there's much more than meets the eye. This week, we're going to talk about direct air capture costs, CO2 pipelines, and the systems problem of climate change. Now, with my involvement with the Carbon Business Council, a trade association representing over 100 carbon removal organizations, as well as my other work and commentary in the broader carbon removal, or CDR, as it's commonly known, space, this week's story was a difficult one to broach for me personally. But all the more necessary because we climate insiders are the ones that need to be taking the hardest look at our assumptions around solutions if we're going to be out there selling them to the world. Today, we're going to look at two new and emerging challenges, or let's call them considerations, for engineered carbon removal, which is the gold standard in terms of permanence and measurability, and is often held up as a bipartisan solution to climate change that even oil companies can get behind. And we will get a glimpse of the true systems nature of the climate transition through a look at these challenges. The first one, for direct air capture carbon removal combined with storage. Instead of the holy grail of sub 100 per ton, that's often been cited as a plausible future target, the report says that net costs will be in the range of $226 up to $835 per ton, with median prices around $350 per ton. This analysis was conducted by researchers at ETH Zurich, the highly regarded Swiss public research university known for its engineering, science, and technology programs, in collaboration with the Institute for Science, Technology, and Policy, which is a federally funded research and development center in the US. Now, I think this is a hugely important piece of research, and it was really underreported, possibly because it was behind an academic paywall, and it was very technical in its full analysis, or possibly for other reasons that I'm not aware of, but I thought it was really worth taking the time to dig in a bit more. Now, first, a little bit of context. The $100 per ton price isn't merely a nice, easy-to-remember round number. It's important because it's the price target established by Frontier, the Advanced Market Commitment Coalition that includes Stripe, Alphabet, Shopify, Meta, and McKinsey in collaboration with the U.S. Department of Energy. The idea behind an advanced market commitment is that these companies, as buyers, are saying, we're willing to put in the early investment at much higher prices so that these technologies can get to market and we can be a part of driving their prices down so that they can scale. These are serious players who have coalesced deep subject matter experts spanning science, technology, and economics to come up with the thesis for Frontier and its requirement that any technology it backs have a path to being affordable at scale. Remember, that's the whole point of an advanced market commitment, is that they're unlocking market accessibility through affordability. And here they define affordable as sub $100 per ton, which would be quite a jump from the estimated $1,000 per ton that direct air capture costs today. Now, something to clarify is that even though Frontier originally intended this price target to reflect an average CDR cost across a variety of solutions, including both nature-based and engineered carbon removal methods, so more of a portfolio price, it's sort of become the de facto benchmark for every type of carbon removal, including direct air capture. It's now commonly viewed and spoken about as the price at which direct air capture becomes economically viable. I'm not sure that that was Frontier's intention with setting that $100 per ton price, but it's one of the things that gets captured by media as well as through repeated conversations from experts and from stakeholders, and it just kind of takes hold as the norm. Now, if you followed the carbon removal industry at all, you likely already know about the $100 per ton price mark because it comes up so often in discussions with carbon removal founders, investors, buyers, and any other type of industry participant. For example, the World Economic Forum has pointed to $100 per ton as the key price threshold for triggering widespread adoption or deployment of direct air capture. And the highly credible International Energy Agency has gone so far as to say, with deployment and innovation, capture costs could fall to under $100 per ton. But this new research from ETH Zurich and the Institute for Science, Technology, and Policy is quite bravely going against the consensus to say that it did not find that $100 per ton was within reach, even at a scale of 1 gigaton of CO2 removed per year. Now, for context on that size, the US is targeting approximately 1 gigaton of CO2 removed per year by 2050, combining both land sinks like forests, grasslands, and soils, and engineered solutions. But because conventional CDR methods are expected to saturate by mid-century, there's a real need to scale up novel CDR methods, which include direct air capture. Now, for all of the environmentalists out there, why direct air capture? How are our problems going to be solved by giant machines sucking CO2 out of the air, which is the old stereotypical image, but which is increasingly inaccurate, by the way, as DAC form factors get more and more diverse? Well, it's because direct air capture offers a highly scalable, permanent, and easily measurable, reportable, and verifiable CDR method. It resolves a lot of the issues that typically undermine carbon removal. Challenges like forests burning up and releasing all their captured and stored carbon in one wildfire-fueled coup, or how to reliably measure emissions displacement from clean cook stove deployment and actual usage, and many, many other examples across every method from regenerative agriculture practices to increased soil carbon sequestration to enhanced rock or ocean-based carbon removal, which run into limitations on space and scale. So it's viewed by technologists and economists as a so-called backstop technology, which is a term that refers to any new technology that can serve as a direct substitute for a limited resource. For example, the limited resource of land for planting 1 trillion trees. Backstop technologies are defined by being able to draw on abundant production inputs to create close substitutes for finite or exhaustible resources. And they're an important concept in environmental economics, They're an important concept in environmental economics where we're frequently talking about limited resources and limitless future demand. In theory, they basically let us not worry about the limited resource, and they imply inherent scalability. Now, all that said, DAC is still very nascent today. There are 18 direct air capture facilities around the world today, which might be more or less than you thought. It's more than I thought. And they currently capture 10,000 tons of CO2 per year, which is the equivalent of 2,112 passenger vehicles driven for 1 year. That sounds pretty good for the early innings, until you realize that the US emitted 6.34 billion tons of CO2 in 2022. That's the US alone, 6.34 billion tons. Whoa. And we have about 290 million passenger vehicles driving on our roads. By the way, the US has 350 million people? 290 million passenger vehicles is more than one per driver. If you think about all the kids out there that make up the population that are not old enough to drive or even own vehicles. So anyway, all that's to say we have a long way to go before direct air capture scales into its scalability ambitions. And actually, that's even the easy and doable part. As a backstop technology, it does not have inherent resource limitations in theory. But a key factor to driving scalability and mass deployment of any technology is cost. Historically, cost has been the biggest barrier to DAC. Some optimistic estimates put its cost at around $600 per ton, but in reality, it's more like $1,000 per ton today. And this is true across the various flavors of DAC, since, as I kind of alluded to earlier, DAC itself is actually a catch-all for a few different technologies that all concentrate CO2 from the air. Coming back to the ETH Zurich report, the researchers' findings showed cost ranges at the 1 gigaton per year removed cumulative capacity to be closer to $341 per ton for liquid solvent systems like Carbon Engineering's approach, and the range there is $226 to $544 per ton at 90% confidence. For solid sorbent direct air capture, it was $374 with a range of $281 up to $579 per ton. And for calcium oxide ambient weathering, such as Heirloom's approach, the price was set at $371 per ton. This is the $371 per ton, but with the highest range variation, with a range between $230 all the way up to $835 per ton at 90% confidence. Now, these aren't $1,000 per ton, but the upper limit for calcium oxide ambient weathering is $835. It's not too far from $1,000, but the median price targets are not at $1,000 a ton, but they're also not at $100 a ton. And the researchers are quick to point out that even though the costs they landed on do not get down to the 100 per ton threshold that has become the benchmark standard, they could potentially make sense cost-wise as alternatives to even more expensive things like sustainable aviation fuels, which are really expensive and are projected to range from $245 to $409 per ton by 2050. Now, how the researchers arrived at these numbers is important. Instead of asking experts for projections or using equations borrowed from solar cost curves, which are a fundamentally different technology, as we know, and use case, and yet which is the most common way we get these numbers for some reason, they derived component-level experience rates and used those to get probabilistic cost extrapolations using multi-component experience curves. Here, it's worth a brief sidebar on experience curves, because they're pretty cool, and why this methodological approach is so strong here. The experience curve is a theory that describes the relationship between a company's experience making something and its cost of production. I'm vastly simplifying here. Specifically, though, the more experience a company has, the lower its cost of production. It's a model that's been proven out across many different types of products and companies. By individually looking at and then combining experience curves from multiple components and then doing additional analysis to bring them together, which is especially useful for composite technologies that use a combination of novel and commercially available components, exactly the way DAC currently does, they're less likely to overestimate cost reductions due to not separating out individual experience curves. They then combine these CapEx projections with data and projections for electricity costs, including factoring in falling costs for tracking solar PV and storage, and different variations for nuclear and geothermal sources of energy. This research was wonky and comprehensive, and it was carried out by serious analysts who do not have a vested interest in selling or buying carbon, specifically via direct air capture. Even so, they're still qualifying their own work by saying, hey, direct air capture could still make economic sense for hard-to-abate industries like aviation, since it'll still be somewhat cheaper than sustainable aviation fuels. The number of times they had to add this qualifier into their report shows how challenging it is to produce work that goes against popular consensus in any category but especially if that work is counter to climate optimism. We're not scared of real talk here, though, and in fact, we are about to do even more of it. So, if you remember at the beginning of this episode, I mentioned that there are two emerging challenges for engineered carbon removal. This new cost research is one of them, but the second one is in a different domain. In the last few months, a totally separate controversy has been brewing across multiple states in the Midwest over several thousand miles of CO2 pipeline that would transport point source captured CO2 to its final resting place deep underground in North Dakota. Now, this is a big, big business. One pipeline company, Summit Carbon Solutions, could be eligible for as much as $18 billion in federal tax benefits over the next 12 years. And even if it doesn't hit that high estimate, it would still most likely generate enough in tax credits to cover most or even all of its construction and operating costs. There are very few businesses in the world that you can start and run for free, but this could be one of them. Summit and other CO2 pipeline companies are facing heavy backlash from local landowners and some environmentalists who don't want the pipelines, literally, in their backyards. Now, before you go all urban climate bro on me and start calling these Midwesterners NIMBYs who don't care about climate change, you should know that what they've experienced isn't dissimilar from what's been going on in the Osage Nation in its fight with NL Energy, which we covered on episode 7. Several of these companies have approached their would-be neighbors with threats of property seizure if they don't cooperate and grant them easements to build the infrastructure in their yards. And there are legitimate safety issues to having a CO2 pipeline in your yard or very close to your home. This was brought up by a 2020 CO2 pipeline rupture that released 31,405 barrels of highly compressed liquid CO2 that instantly converted back into gas and settled like a pollution blanket on top of a little town that was about a mile away. People in the town started having seizures, falling unconscious in the middle of the road, becoming dazed and unresponsive to commands. Cars, at least non-electric ones, all of a sudden stopped working because combustion requires oxygen, which was stamped out by the CO2. CO2 is heavier than air and displaces it, so it just sort of sits there. Some people from the town are still reporting ongoing health issues now, even 4 years later. So if one of these giant pipelines were coming to your vegetable garden, it might be a little alarming. But if it's in the name of climate mitigation, might it be worth it? Well, this is where things get tricky. While these pipelines could eventually be used for direct air capture, their current most common use case is for transporting CO2 that's been captured at the point of emissions from a source that might surprise you, as it did me: ethanol facilities. Summit Carbon Solutions, the company that stands to get up to $18 billion in federal tax credits, has deals with multiple ethanol producers that would add dozens of facilities to its pipeline. In many ways, you could think of the pipelines as kind of a lifeline for ethanol, which people are finally starting to realize may not be the environmentally friendlier gas alternative that it has been billed as. And this is important. Recently, in a classic enemy of my enemy is my friend move, the National Corn Growers Association, aka Big Corn, has teamed up with its longtime foe, decades-long foe, the American Petroleum Institute, aka Big Oil, to oppose EVs and call on the federal government to ease its EV mandates and go for blended fuels instead. Now, corn is a huge industry in the U.S. The U.S. produces 812 billion pounds of corn each year, 36% of which goes towards ethanol production. Ethanol is second only to animal feed, but it's still ahead of, fun fact, high fructose corn syrup, glucose, and dextrose, which is actually the third largest corn category, but subject for another podcast entirely. Out of those billions of pounds of corn, I should clarify, it's not 1 billion, it's 812 billion. The U.S. produced 15.36 billion gallons of ethanol in 2022. Together with Brazil and its dwindling Amazon, U.S. ethanol makers produce over 80% of the world's ethanol, most of which gets consumed in the US in the form of blended gasolines. According to the US Energy Information Administration, 6 states account for the majority, more than 70%, of US fuel ethanol production. And that's Iowa, Nebraska, Illinois, Minnesota, Indiana, and South Dakota. And these are also the states where the proposed pipelines are causing the biggest controversy. Now, ethanol is not good. It generates CO2 emissions at production because it's produced from a fermentation process that off-gasses CO2. And this is the CO2 that gets captured by these massive pipelines to be stored in depleted wells in North Dakota. And then when it's combusted, it generates CO2 and water vapor, which is an even worse greenhouse gas. Gallon for gallon, it's about 70% of the emissions intensity of gasoline when combusted. And then it also has a massive land use footprint. And we know that deforestation and turning native grassland into row cropland also erodes our natural land-based carbon sinks. In fact, it's such a big industry that some experts point to ethanol's growth as a factor in driving up food costs. All that land is going towards growing fuel instead of growing dairy or cows, which are their own climate and environmental, not to mention with factory farming, ethical problem. But the point here is that EV makers are now up against a lot more than big oil. They're going to have to contend with big ag, too, storage, which will rely on the same pipeline infrastructure and sequestration wells. Is it possible that this dynamic is pitting EVs against direct air capture at a time when we know we desperately need both? So now we start to see the system, an ever-widening cast of characters for this complex climate drama that's now unfolding. Over here, we have direct air capture technology companies, funders, and stakeholders who are struggling and will continue to struggle with cost curves, which will likely suffer negative impacts if transport and storage infrastructure is hampered. Over here, we have pipeline builders who rely on ethanol producers as their core customer, but have to contend with landowners up and down the Midwestern corridor who are fighting their projects and winning. Over there, we have EV makers and their entire ecosystem who are not only up against big oil, but now also big ag, and possibly the CO2 pipeline builders that stand to make billions from ethanol carbon capture. And we have climate change raging through the middle of all of it. Why does all this complexity matter? Because climate change is a systems problem that requires an everything, everywhere, all at once approach. Hat tip to my friend and fellow climate investor Kirsty Chu for the most fitting adaptation of a movie title to an existential problem. We need carbon removal. That much is clear. And direct air capture is the most scalable carbon removal, the most expensive one as well, but also the one that will be there for us when all other options have reached their limit, and we still have a few dozen parts per million to go. If DAC never reaches market viability, what does that mean for other forms of carbon removal? Will they be more popular as demand seeks low-cost supply? Or will it buoy prices and therefore depress demand all around? And if DAC never reaches market viability, what does it mean for our ability to reach the climate targets that rely on large-scale carbon removal? There's no neat bow to tie on top of these stories. Instead, they're the perfect illustration of the wicked nature of climate change, a challenge that transcends a singular solution or neat narrative. I often wish I had a magic wand and could just use it to get everyone to adopt EVs, eat less animal products, and buy less fast fashion, just for example. But if it worked, what would happen to corn farmers? And then what would happen to those CO2 pipelines? And then what would happen to DAC prices? Systems thinking is the opposite of having a magic wand. It requires looking at as many pieces as we can find, even if they don't fit nice, linear, hero versus villain storylines. Systems problem solving might require an even harder task, and that's compromise. Thank you, as always, for tuning in to Climate Money, and see you again